It's 35 years since the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law. So why are people with disabilities still disadvantaged? We talk with a disability advocate. Plus, we take a look at other stories making the headlines from around the region. This is Connecticut East This Week. Hello, I'm Brian Scott-Smith. It's 35 years this year since the Americans with Disability Act was signed into law, promising to usher in a new era of protecting people with disabilities from discrimination in many areas of public life. But 35 years on, and people with disabilities are still being discriminated against and living on the margins of society. Recently, Connecticut College in New London celebrated 40 years of disability advocacy and opened a new disability cultural centre to showcase the past, present and future of their commitment to students with disabilities. The centre was officially opened by John Sharon, a former student of the college who is disabled himself, and back in 1984 he started a movement at the school to have them recognise the needs of students and people with disabilities. Now 40 years on, John is still advocating for people with disabilities, and I caught up with him for a frank discussion about why things haven't changed as much as they should have. We start off the interview talking about his time at Connecticut College and what started his fight for disability rights. John, just explain to us, this year, April 1st, marks 40 years of disability advocacy at Connecticut College. You are from 1986, a student back then. You spearheaded efforts to improve campus accessibility. Take us back. What was wrong and why did you need it to change?
The first thing to say is that when I got to campus as a freshman in the fall of 1982, I wasn't really thinking much about accessibility. I wasn't thinking a whole lot even about me as a person with a disability. I was predominantly just living my life and was well used to navigating inaccessible spaces, never thought about accessibility very much, to be honest with you. And this was, of course, 8 years before the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the ADA just wasn't a thing. Some places were more accessible than others, but again, I wasn't really thinking about it. And then I think it was around my sophomore year, some friends had asked me what they thought about accessibility at Connecticut College. And they had been having an education class, and I guess accessibility had come up in the class. And so they asked me, who was the only noticeably disabled student on campus at the time, what I thought. And I'll never forget the conversation because I was walking down from the fourth floor of a classroom building and they stopped me mid-stairs and they asked me what I thought about accessibility at Conn College. And I said, I've never really thought about it before. And they were truly baffled by my reply. But in the subsequent weeks and months, I started to get curious and I started to pay attention and started to look. And the more I looked, the more I saw. And what I saw was a place that was totally inaccessible for people who might use wheelchairs for transport or who might be deaf or who might be blind. And it started to make me mad because I thought, this is a place that should be open to all kinds of bodies, and it just wasn't. And so that was really the impetus. I started to ask a lot of questions. Why isn't there an elevator going down to the squash courts below the new gym they were building at the time? And the answer I got from the architect, because I had a chance to meet with the architect mid-construction, was, why would somebody in a wheelchair want to go down to the squash courts? And I said, to play squash. And he had never thought of that before. So started asking questions about lack of accessible parking, lack of accessible entranceways to buildings, and just so many stairs. And that's really what started it. Honestly, it was an awakening for myself about seeing things that I had not seen or noticed before.
If it's not too personal a question, can you just explain to us what your disability is?
Not personal at all. I have a disability called arthrogryposis multiplex congenita, and it is a very rare condition, birth condition that impacts very few number of people worldwide, actually. Really, it's a condition where The limbs don't move very well in utero, might be because of a virus my mom had when she was pregnant that she didn't even know she had. Nobody really knows the origins of it. But what it turns out to be predominantly is limbs that are curved under in certain degrees, or muscle mass that's not fully developed because the anterior horn cells in the spine, not to get too sciencey and geeky on you, but the anterior horn cells in the spine aren't developing in utero, and so therefore the limbs are not moving as quickly as they need to. And so when bones are growing at such a quick rate at that stage of development, they need to be moving. And people with arthrogryposis, just their limbs aren't moving, and so they naturally curve under. So in a nutshell, my story is that I was not supposed to live at all. And if I was going to live, I was probably going to be, they used this terrible phrase, mentally retarded back then. And the story goes that the doctors told my parents that I should be put into an institution so that, frankly, so that they could get on with the rest of their lives. My mom didn't do that. She would come down to the hospital every day to feed me. And she noticed that my reaction was the exact same as everybody, my older two sisters who aren't disabled. And she's basically said, there's nothing wrong with his brain, so he's going to come home with me. So that's the short version of that story.
So just explain to us, obviously it is a physical disability, it is not a mental health or a mental disability. So how did that impact you initially? Clearly, you've not gotten over it, but you deal with it every day. But back then at Con College, how did having that physical disability cause issues, which is why you then went on to say, hey, you need to change things for people with disabilities here?
Great question. I was born into a family that very much didn't allow me to consider myself different from other people. There was very much this mindset of there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing that you can't do, and we're going to do everything we can to help you figure things out. And the first place I went to school, it's a long answer in some ways, but I think it's helpful and instructive. The first place I went to school was a place I grew up in Washington, D.C., was a place called the D.C. Society for Crippled Children, if you can imagine that. And I had been, for the first 5 years of my life, had really believed that I was not disabled because that's the message I got. And when I went to this school for kids who were disabled for the most part, I thought, I'm not sure I belong here. I'm not proud of that, to be honest with you, when I talk about that, but that's the truth. And I eventually, the following year for first grade, went to a sort of mainstream school. And that's when I first noticed that I was different from everybody else. So the way I talk about it when I talk to students or talk to groups about my story, I talk about being fully conscious of being in the world of same and being in the world of different at the same time. And that didn't really occur to me until obviously much later, but the concept was very much real. And so when I went to school in a mainstream school, that's when the first time I really fully felt disabled. And because kids are kids and kids will make fun of you and make all kinds of otherness toward you. So my mindset had always been that, again, because of family of origin, I was going to do everything I possibly could to live a normal life, whatever the word normal means, right? And a lot of the kids that I started going to school with in first grade, I stayed with, and over the years, they got used to me, I got used to them, and we were in this bubble, I think, for a long time. And so when I graduated high school and went off to Connecticut College, I was pretty comfortable with just being around people who knew me and knew who I was and knew who I navigated through the world. When I got to College, I was really stunned actually by the fact that within a first couple of weeks of school, everybody seemed to know who I was. And I was really surprised by that. I know really why that is. Of course, I know why that is, but it was hilarious to me as well. And the joke was that I figured all these people know who I am. I should run for class president and see what happens. The joke turned out to be on me because I won the election. And suddenly I had to start being presidential and do all the things. But I think, and it's something that my mother said to me when I was probably in elementary school, when I would get frustrated that people would make fun of me and not really see me for who I really was. She always said, you need to be patient because the more people get to know you, the more they're going to see you for who you are. And their teasing or bullying or whatever it was is going to go away. And she was right for the most part. And so when I got to college, there wasn't that, obviously, but it took a very sort of interesting twist in a sense that I was suddenly like back to feeling like, oh, I'm different from everybody else. That was a reminder. And I was pretty clueless about my identity as a disabled person at the time. I really didn't see that as a part of my identity. If anything, I pushed that aside, pushed it down because I wanted to prove to the world that I wasn't disabled. And I considered myself as an athlete. I got involved in soccer and did playing in soccer, but mostly was starting to coach and started to do some coaching at College actually. And so I very much saw myself as and wanted when I showed up at College in the fall of 1982, very much to just be a college student, be a typical college student. I just wanted to fit in, right?
Let me take you back. You and 10 fellow students initiated a demonstration using wheelchairs to illustrate the lack of accessibility back then on the campus. What do you recall of that time, and how did you feel when you decided to take that very important decision to make a very public statement?
As I was beginning to see the inaccessibility of the campus and I was starting to get angry, I knew that my anger wasn't going to get anywhere because what was really needed was conversation. What was really needed was relationship building to change people's hearts, right? I was not going to allow my sort of newfound anger to get in the way of that. And so I turned it to activism. And so we did a disability awareness week, and we had local pharmacies donate wheelchairs for a week, and we had 10 students use these wheelchairs to go to classes for the week. And the rule was that if you were going to be using a wheelchair, you could not get out of your wheelchair to walk up and down stairs. You had to be carried, and somebody else had to carry your chair up and down stairs. And we very deliberately chose students who had classes on the fourth floor of the administration building or the basement of the chemistry building or whatever it was. And it was a remarkable week. We were so excited about what we were seeing in front of us. And we just thought, this is holding up a mirror for the college that maybe they didn't really want to see, but at the same time was really important that we did it. And we were planning a final day of a big party. We were going to do speeches and music and wheelchair races down the middle of the boulevard in the middle of campus. And the morning of the event, I got a phone call from somebody in the communications office at Connecticut College. She was totally on board with what we were doing. She loved it. She said, John, because let me also back up and say we had reached out to lots of local media to cover this event, the final day. And so this person got a phone call from one of the local radio stations to say that they had gotten a phone call from somebody at the college telling them not to come because the day had been canceled. The day had not been canceled at all. And so I said, call them back and say they need to come because we're having a party. And later, I think I know who had done that. He was an administrator, and he and I had some conversations about he was worried about lawsuits and that sort of thing. But we did it anyway, and it was a blast.
Fast forward 40 years, on April 1st, a new Disability Cultural Centre at College. You are the keynote speaker there. What does this mean to you to see this centre open, and the fact that even 40 years on, people with disabilities still really not seen the way that they should be seen by the general population? What does having this centre and the academic offerings mean for people with disabilities and for those that don't?
I was so excited when I first heard about this center because I thought this is, in some ways, a culmination of the work we started. I acknowledge that, but also something that is so needed on college campuses and in our culture today because of precisely what you said. People with disabilities are still living on the margins. They're still having to struggle to be accepted, even though we have laws in place now that get people into the buildings and can allow for people to get access to programs and services and whatever. But the mind shift hasn't happened the way that people thought it would, I think. When the ADA was passed in 1990, George Herbert Walker Bush famously said, the walls of exclusion are finally coming down. And he was right, but there was an attitudinal aspect to people's exclusionary practices that hasn't come down fully for folks. And there continues in our culture to be this sense of othering of people with disabilities, a sense of maybe fear a little bit, fear of the unknown. And I think that comes from a lack of exposure. I really do. I think it goes back to what my mom said to me when I was a kid, that people just aren't used to that kind of noticeable difference if it's a physical disability. We've definitely gotten better as a culture, but we have still so much further to go because I do think that people living with a disability, physical disability, cognitive disability, learning disability, we live in a world that is made for the non-disabled. And until that changes, it's going to be an exhaustive exercise to live your life in a non-disabled world if you have a disability. One of the things that I love about the mission statement of the Cultural Center at Conn College, there's a line in there about promoting radical rest. And I just love that because it acknowledges that being a person with a disability can sometimes be exhausting, only because there's so much cognitive load that we have to carry just to live our lives. And when I think about that, I realize that I carry a lot of cognitive load that I'm not even aware I'm doing, that I'm carrying. And so I'm super excited that this center is a place where students can find community for each other. They can find rest, they can find advocacy, they can find intersectionality with other identities. And this is especially important coming at a time when our culture is really, right now, in our moment in history, we are endangering people who are living on the margins of society based on identities that are not primary. And so I think a cultural center like this is so important for the times that we're living in now.
Do you also feel as well, John, that as a society here in the US, there's still that uncomfortable factor that people seem to have, especially when you look around the rest of the world? And the world isn't perfect, and there is no perfect country when it comes to people with disabilities. But America does seem to lag behind when you look at places like in Europe or in Asia, where advances and acceptance seems to be much broader, much wider. And like I said, when we look at ourselves here in the US, it is, oh my gosh, it's somebody with a disability. I feel very uncomfortable. How do we change that?
I think that actually stems from the fact that we have this, one of our founding documents is called the Declaration of Independence. And we have this myth, and I call it I do believe it's a myth, of the independent American mindset that basically allows us to believe or to think that we don't need each other to survive. We don't need each other to coexist. My fundamental belief, especially the more advocacy that I've done, even in the last 15 or 20 years, I've come to realize that disability is a fundamental part of what it means to be a human being. Everybody I talk to, wherever I go, when I go into schools or houses of worship or other places, businesses, whatever, when I do talks to these places, I end up hearing and noticing everybody has a connection to disability in one form or another. And so it's not that nobody has a connection with disability. In fact, disability, as I said, is a fundamental part of the human condition, I think. But it's that we don't want to embrace the notion that we actually need each other. We are a country of interdependent people. And and I think humanity is a interdependent concept. We can't survive by ourselves. Disability gives us the opportunity to flex empathy muscles that we wouldn't normally be able to flex or necessarily be inclined to flex. And in America, because we've got this notion of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, the fully independent, whatever, it gets in the way of really understanding the interdependent nature of humanity and the interdependent nature of the role of disability that it plays in making us more fully human.
Is this also about the language, what actually disability means? Because as we do this interview, I'm wearing glasses. If I take them off, I am visually disabled. I cannot do many things without wearing glasses. So therefore, I am disabled from that point of view. Is this about the language and about saying to people, disability is much wider than what you think it actually means?
I believe it is. I believe it is much bigger than just a condition. This is why the medical model, when you look at different models of disability that are discussed in academia, the medical model doesn't really work because it implies that it's a condition that can be fixed, and it implies that there's a state of normal, and I would put that word in quotes. That's not true for any human being that I know. And so I don't think we do away with the word disabled. I don't think we change the language. We tried over the various decades to soften language, a person differently abled or physically challenged or whatever. And I'm not a fan of masking things around language. In fact, if anything, my evolution has come out of in the disability rights movement is really claiming disabled as an adjective and as an identity marker. And the more we do that, I think that's going to give people permission to say, you know what? All of us are disabled in one way or another. And the other place where I think language can be helpful is that instead of saying a person without disability, to say non-disabled is a little bit less dichotomous, and I think it gives more cultural relevance to the sense of a shared experience of what it's like to be fully human.
John Sharon, thank you for the interview.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thanks for all your interest in this topic and in the center, and I'm super grateful.
Time now for a look at other stories making the headlines this week. 2 disabled individuals in Connecticut, unable to qualify for Medicaid in the state, have filed a court case against the Department of Social Services for violating state constitution. Laura D'Erico and Frank Caggiano allege the state's lower income limits for Husky for disabled adults violates the state's Equal Protection Clause. D'Erico, who has multiple sclerosis, spoke at a press conference expressing her concerns.
Due to my disability, I rely on Social Security disability insurance. However, I find myself caught in a frustrating paradox. My SSDI payment is just $76 above the asset limit from the state's healthcare program, Husky T. And as a result, I am ineligible for coverage that I desperately need.
Sheldon Toobman is the lawyer for the 2 complainants and said the expansion of Medicaid for all goes back to the introduction of the Affordable Care Act.
Connecticut was an early adopter of the Medicaid expansion. Now I think the 41 states have done the expansion. And that really highlighted because people who are not disabled who qualified for that program, which is a wonderful expansion, we all support it. But people who are not disabled who qualified for that were in better shape than people with disabilities who had a lower access to health care, and frankly, people with disabilities overall have a greater need for access to health care.
Their complaint states that in 2023, the legislature passed a law ending long-standing discrimination in Medicaid income equality limits, but in the 2024 legislative session, that decision was reversed before the new law even had time to take effect. The plaintiffs say the reversal was due to Governor Lamont's opposition to bending fiscal guardrails to spend available funds. In a statement, the Department of Social Services said they are reviewing the complaint and do not comment on pending litigation. More than 900 Connecticut firefighters will now be able to benefit from enhanced cancer screenings for free in the state. Governor Lamont and State Comptroller Sean Scanlon announced the new benefit for firefighters who are enrolled in the State Employee Health Plan and Partnership Plan. Scanlon, whose office runs the State Employee Health Plan, explained the new benefit.
Starting on May 1st, every single firefighter, 900 firefighters right now that are on our plan, starting on May 1st, will be eligible for 1 free preventative scan every 2 years to make sure that they're able to catch the disease early before they start having the symptoms. And if we can catch things early, we can treat it early, which is a life-saving thing.
Peter Brown is the president of the Uniformed Professional Firefighters Association and said screenings like these are critical for firefighters' health and well-being.
Occupational cancer has become an epidemic in the fire service. It's the #1 killer of firefighters. It accounts for nearly 75% of all line-of-duty deaths. Here in Connecticut, we've lost 5 firefighters to cancer over the last 5 years and have over 30 diagnoses of our members since we started tracking those statistics only a couple short years ago. That trend has to stop.
The expected cost to the state for these screenings will be around $150,000 annually. Cancer is a leading cause of death among US firefighters, from toxic chemicals and smoke to PFAS in their firefighting gear. The future of the Head Start program that for the last 60 years has supported children's growth from birth to 5 years old is under threat from the latest Trump administration federal budget cuts. Jessica Sager is the CEO of the New Haven-based nonprofit All Our Kin and says the program means a lot for many families across the nation.
Head Start is perhaps the most powerful program that we have in this country to provide childcare to families that are struggling, and it transforms the lives of both children and their parents. We have early indications that the new federal administration may be considering cutting Head Start funding, which would leave 750,000 of children across this country and their parents struggling and in very dire straits.
Already, Head Start federal administrative staff have been cut, with the entire staff of Head Start Boston that used to administer areas like Connecticut have now gone. Sager says although for the moment the funding hasn't been cut, she's not sure how it will be distributed.
I do know that the money is available via an electronic portal, but these regional offices play a key role in program oversight and also in program support. They are really partners with the programs on the ground. So we have lost both Region 1, which is where Connecticut is, and Region 2, where New York is. Both those offices and 3 others across the country have been closed. We're concerned about what that means for support for Head Start programming. We are also concerned about what it may signal about cuts to actual Head Start program dollars.
While states wait to see what might happen to Head Start, Connecticut and New York have promised to provide state aid when it comes to childcare and child services, but Sager says this will only go so far. And US Senator Richard Blumenthal is ringing the alarm bell over the closure of regional offices of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. Blumenthal said having a regional FEMA office in nearby Boston serving not only Connecticut but the whole of the Northeast has shown its effectiveness time and again, especially during the extreme flooding in the state last year. But it's not just FEMA's response during a natural disaster. The agency also manages the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, or BRIC, which is also being ended, says Blumenthal.
Ending the BRIC program means that Bridgeport will go without $47.5 million for its resilience program on the waterfront. It means that other projects, about 20 of them around the state of Connecticut, totaling $116 million in federal funds, will be ended.
Meanwhile, Ronell Higgins, the Commissioner for the Department of Emergency Services and Public Protection in the state that works with FEMA when situations occur, says because of the changing situation in Washington, D.C. around FEMA's future, he and his department are having to think differently about how they will tackle future emergency situations.
I know that right now, from the canceled flood mitigation projects, the potential loss of funding for local officials who supervise emergency management, all of that is weighing on the minds of my staff and local emergency managers. All this, as we creep towards hurricane season in June. With these new challenges, we must begin to think differently, and we will think differently. We will remain prepared.
Blumenthal says if the Trump administration does go ahead with its FEMA office closures, it will mean the states will be left to handle natural disaster situations themselves, which means they will have to bear any costs and hope for reimbursement from the federal government, meaning longer delays and recovery for affected communities. That's all from us for this edition. Do send us your questions and story ideas to the show via our website at connecticut-east.com or Facebook or Twitter at Connecticut East and on Instagram at Connecticut East This Week. And you can listen to the show again on our social platforms on demand and by asking your smart speaker to play Connecticut East This Week podcast. And please like, follow and share on your social media too. I'm Brian Scott Smith. Thank you for listening.